Hello, this is Chiak. Okay, no, everything's. Hello, this is Chiak. We are on the last part 7, and the epilogue of Dead Space Martyr. This chapter actually looks a bit shorter than the other ones, so let's get this going. Part 7, The End of the World. 62. Even before he had opened the hatch, he could hear a skittering sound from inside, could see through the glass dim shapes moving below as well. Here goes nothing, he thought. He threw open the hatch and went in. He was only a few steps down the ladder when something dropped onto him. It struck his shoulder and he had a glimpse of it before it wrapped itself around his face. It consisted of a human head, stretched and rubbery on a network of tendrils. It immediately started to smother him. He couldn't see. He tried to bat it off with the plasma cutter, but it simply wrapped its tendrils tighter. He banged it against the rungs of the ladder, but it still wouldn't let go. Shit, he thought. I'm going to die. Blindly, his hand found the trigger of the cutter and started it up. He raised it slowly, trying not to cut through his own face, and succeeded in nearly cutting all the way through the side rail of the ladder. He was beginning to black out. He tried again, closer to the face this time, and felt the blade go through the creature's flesh. It loosened its grip, and he shook it off, watching it bounce off the rung just in front of him and tumble down. The worst part about it was that as it fell, he recognized the face. It was stretched and red, severely deformed, but he was sure it had belonged to Field. As he watched it strike the rungs below him and then spiral down, it was like he had killed Field himself. He caught his breath and then continued descending. The emergency lighting cast shadows everywhere. He kept seeing things moving in them. He heard a noise at a little distance, then closer. Something was slithering up the side of the ladder. He looked down and tried to see it, but saw nothing. He stayed still, listening, but heard nothing. Maybe I'm just imagining it, he thought. But when he took another step, he heard it again, and looking down, he caught a brief glimpse of the same sort of sinewy, pulsy thing that had popped Field's head off, and then it disappeared. It was on the other side of the ladder. He tried to get around to see it and caught a brief glimpse and then lost it again. The sound, though, was closer now. He wrapped one arm around the ladder and hung there, waiting. Where was it? And then suddenly he saw it, just a few feet below him now, its gray body blending in with the ladder. As he watched, one end of it left the ladder and started wavering like a charmed snake, looking for flesh to grab onto. And then suddenly it whipped up and wrapped around his foot. It wrapped itself tight and hard, almost dislodging him, leaving him hanging by one arm, legs dangling in the air. He tried to swing the plasma cutter down to saw it off, but it was too low. He'd have to let go to get it down to it, which would mean falling. It had started pulsing, tightening, and then began working itself up his ankle and onto his leg. Struggling for a foothold with the other leg, he finally managed to find it. He lifted himself on his toes as far as he could go, the ankle feeling like it might tear off, and swung his arm loose, grabbing hold again a few rungs down. That was enough. He could reach now. He sawed it in half with the plasma cutter. A cord jetted from it, and then it fell. Feeling dizzy, he clung on tight. He might have stayed like that forever, except his head, pressed against the ladder's side rails, heard a dull pounding. Something else was coming. Still dizzy, he looked down. 2 others were already starting up the ladder, these more humanoid, the kind with sights sprouting out of their shoulders. They held onto the ladder with the tiny hands sprouting from their bellies, their scythes waving madly back and forth as they climbed. He climbed frantically up, back the way he had come, trying to get to the level ground of the platform, knowing all the time that they were gaining on him. He could almost feel their scythe slicing up and taking off his legs. Then suddenly he was at the top, on his knees and panting. He slung the cutter's strap over his back and let it hang, pulling the chainsaw around. Precariously balanced, he tugged on the ripcord. The first time he didn't catch, nor the second time. The first one was already there, the tips of its scythes visible over the edge of the platform, its head just coming into view. He tore the ripcord back hard, and this time it caught. He revved it and then leaned down and pushed it into the creature. The chain blade whipped the blood in all directions, spattering him from head to toe. He stepped off the ladder, the chainsaw sputtering in his hands. Were there others? It was a big room, poorly lit. He moved cautiously toward the passage to the labs that would lead him down to the airlocks. There were spills of flesh here and there around the walls, near the vents. Living, it seemed. He prodded one with his boot, but it didn't seem to respond. Just sat there. He stamped on it, but it didn't seem injured by that either. He was almost to the door of the lab when it came, rushing at him with an almost unholy cry. In the darkness and shadows, he had a hard time seeing it at first. It was just a blur. He revved the chainsaw, trying to keep the blade between him and it, and struck it full in the head. It was the most terrible of the beasts he had seen so far. It backed quickly away, hissing. His jaws was distended, its teeth grown long and predatory, the flesh having torn all the way back to the hinge. Its arms had become forelegs, its body thickening in the front and narrowing in the back. It had a single overly muscled leg in the back, the other leg stretched and emaciated and lashing like a tail. The thinned toes fanned out and flexed at the tail's top. It took a few steps sideways, then gathered itself and leaped. He tried to take its head off with the chainsaw, but was only partly through when the chain caught on something chitinous, and the weapon was torn from his hands, almost dislocating his shoulder. The neck pulsed and spat fluids over his chest, the head leaning to one side and still snarling. The forelegs scratched and tore at him. He groped for the chainsaw but couldn't get to it. Wasn't certain that he'd be able to get it started again anyway. He kicked the creature back and it circled slowly, its head hanging like a loose sack, before springing again. Blinded, it struck just a little to the left of him, smashing into the wall. He was already scrambling up, trying to get the plasma cutter into his hands, and turned on. It knocked him down and into the sickly-smelling tissue that covered the deck, and then reared back, looming over him. He rolled to one side but couldn't avoid its claws tearing through his shirt, and the shoulder beneath pinning one arm down. And then suddenly he had the cutter on. He struck once hard, tearing off the foreleg pinning him. It balanced awkwardly over him on its remaining two limbs. He chopped into the other foreleg and it crashed down. He pushed it back and stumbled away, the shoulder really starting to ache now. He circled it slowly, waiting for a moment to dart in and cut the last leg, when it did a curious thing. It got its remaining leg planted, but rather than using it to leap up at him, as Altman had expected, it flipped the whole body over, landing on its leg tail. It stayed there motionless, perfectly balanced, the last leg contracted back, like the leg of a dead arachnid. It must be dead, Altman thought. He came cautiously forward, but it didn't move. Carefully, he reached out and touched it with the edge of the cutter, and the leg sprang out hard, catching him in the chest and hurling him back against the wall. He lay there for a moment, stunned. His chest felt like it had been caved in. Slowly, he sat up. The creature was still there, still balanced on its tail, its one remaining leg contracted again. Fuck it, he thought. Gathering his weapons, he circled around it, giving a wide berth, and made for the door. The laboratory beyond the door was a shambles. Everything turned over and collapsed, pure carnage. Bodies and pieces of bodies were everywhere. He moved through it cautiously, careful not to touch anything, and out the next door. The next room was almost completely intact, which somehow made him almost more nervous. He moved past the central table into the observation booth. From there, he connected to the vid system, still running on emergency power. He flicked quickly through the cameras he had access to, saw more of the creatures in almost every place he looked. The airlock door between the upper and lower decks, he saw, was opened and shooting sparks. In the space just before it, just one room beyond where Altman was now, between him and the airlock, moved a creeper, maybe even the same creeper that he had seen before. Though, if it was bigger now, and growing. It moved slowly forward, consuming everything, converging everything. Shit, thought Altman. No go that way. He asked the system for alternative paths, but there weren't any. The facility had been very deliberately constructed with one connecting point between its upper and lower halves. As long as the creeper was there was no way forward. Unless I go through the water, he realized. He flicked the vid display to the submarine bay. If he could get there, he could get in. It was 20 meters down? A long swim by any standard, and pressure would be strong as well. And once he was there, he'd have to enter the chamber and close the doors and wait for the water to be pumped out. If that was enough to kill him in and of itself, the cold of the water very well might. Then the display he was looking at was interrupted, cut into by another feed. A face appeared, a grainy black and white feed. "Who's there?" the man said. "Who's in the system?" The man was vaguely familiar. It was, he realized, the man who had taken him to see the marker in its chambers for the first time. What was his name? Harm something. Yes, that was it. Henry Harmon. He switched on his vid feed so the man could see him. "Harmon," he said, "it's Altman. You're alive?" "I thought I was the last one," said Harmon. "It's great to see you. Where are you?" Harmon looked around distractedly, as if for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. "I'm in the marker chamber," he said. "I thought I was trapped, but for whatever reason, those things won't come near the marker. I'm glad I'm not the only one left alive." "I'll come get you," said Altman. "That's not possible," said Harmon. "Before you even go a few steps, they'll tear you to bits." "Can you do me a favor?" asked Altman. "Is there a way you can open the submarine bay doors from there? Do you have authorization?" "Sure," said Harmon. "Why?" "Open them and leave them open," Altman said. "That's how I'll get to you. Oh, and one other thing." "Name it," said Harmon. "Gather everything you can from the system about the marker. Signal, composition, dimension, makeup, anything at all." "All right," said Harmon. "It'll give me something to do." I may have figured out what the marker wants," said Altman. I'll know when I get there, if I get there." Harmon started to say something, but Altman had already switched off. He made his way out of the lab and back in the direction from which he'd come. He searched through the lockers and cabinets, looking for either oxygen or a wetsuit, but found nothing. He'd just have to risk it. He looked at the chainsaw. It was hardly the ideal weapon. When the chain had caught, it almost got him killed. In any case, he couldn't take it. The water would ruin it. The plasma cutter, though, was another matter. It would probably work even after having been through the water. He found two 50-meter coils of rope and hooked them over his shoulder. Then he started climbing the ladder again, back to the hatch. 63. He climbed down the dome to the boat's platform, bucking now with the swells. The submarine bay was below and a little to the left. He went to the far edge of the platform and looked down for it. There it was. He could just make out the glow coming through the open bottom of the hangar. He tied the 2 coils of rope together, tugging on either side of the knot until he was satisfied, and then carefully measured its length. He tied the plasma cutter's strap onto one end of the rope, double knotting it just to be safe. The other end he hitched fast around the mooring. Carefully, he lowered the plasma cutter and the rope into the water until they were gone. Little more to see than the first few meters of rope. He stripped to the waist and carefully limbered up, thinking. He'd have one chance, he knew. Once he'd gone a certain way down, he'd be committed. Either he'd make it into the submarine bay, or he'd drown. He breathed rapidly in and out and then dived, letting the air out through his nose as he went. He swam as quickly as he could straight down, following the rope. The pressure built quickly, his head feeling like it was being squeezed. It felt incredibly slow, like he was making no progress, like he was still just a few meters below the platform. He kept swimming, trying to keep his strokes even and steady and his heart rate constant, trying not to panic. He could hear the blood beating in his ears now, a steady thudding growing slower and slower. Were his limbs slowing down? Or did they just feel like they were? He saw lights. He was close to the submarine bay. No, he thought. Don't look. Stay focused. Just keep swimming down. He felt his lungs struggle, wanting to breathe in air that wasn't there. He made a gurgling sound, had to force himself not to breathe in water. Things all around him seemed slower, much slower. And then he saw it, floating near the end of the rope, the plasma cutter, like a shadow in the darkness. His heart leapt with exhilaration, and things started going dark around the edges, and he thought for a moment he was going to pass out. But when he reached it and grabbed hold of it, he realized he'd never be able to struggle it into the bay with him. He didn't have enough air left, didn't have the strength. He'd have to leave it behind. He let go. He looked to the side, and there it was, just a few meters away, the open submarine bay. He left the rope and swam for it. He would never make it, he realized. He might make it into the submarine bay, but he didn't have enough strength left to close the floor and then wait for the time it took to pump the water out. It was pointless. But something in him kept him swimming anyway. He crossed through the opening and into the bay. He was just heading for the door lock when he caught a flash above him and suddenly had an idea. He shot up as quickly as he could, striking his head hard against the roof, almost knocking himself unconscious. But there, in the corner, was a thin layer of trapped air. He put his face up against the roof and took a gasping breath, water lapping against the side of his mouth. He hung there, floating, breathing in more, until he stopped wheezing, until his heart stopped pounding. It was okay. He was going to be okay. When he felt calm, he dived back into the water and swam down. But instead of swimming to the floor controls, he swam through them and outside. For a moment he was lost, disorientated in the open ocean, and thought he'd gone in the wrong direction. And then he caught sight of the shadow of the rope, realized he was looking too high. He looked down a little, and there it was. He swam to the plasma cutter and grabbed it, immediately striking back for the submarine bay, dragging the rope along with him. With the rope, it was too heavy, the progress very slow. For a moment he considered abandoning the cutter, and then an idea struck him. He turned and switched the cutter on and cut the rope with it. The cutter was heavy, making it so he could use only one arm to swim. It threatened to drag him down. He made it to just beneath the bay floor and then swam desperately up, kicking hard with his legs, a little panicked. By the time he got his fingers around the edge and pulled himself in, he was nearly as exhausted as he had been from the initial swim down. He thrust it into a corner and then swam quickly for the controls for the floor. He pressed the button and held it down. The emergency lights in the room began to flash. Slowly he saw the floor was sliding out of his channel and coming across, coming closed. He swam up for the pocket of air and for a moment couldn't find it. Where was it? He swam back along the ceiling and found a pocket about the size of his fist, just enough to get his face into. He sucked it in, then breathed quickly out, the pocket growing larger. Below him, he heard the water dulled. Below him, he heard the water-dulled clang of the submarine bay floor closing, and then the gentle throb of the pumps. The water level began to drop, and he got his head out. He got his head completely out, took a deep, gasping breath, and immediately blacked out. "Michael," the voice said. "Michael, wake up." He opened his eyes. It was his father. "I asked you to get up," his father said. "How many times do I have to ask?" "In a minute, Dad," he said. His voice sounded strange, hollow, as if coming from a distance. "I said now," said his father. "Get up, or I'll drag you out of bed myself." He didn't move. His dad shook him. He moaned, shook his head. "Dad, get up." His father was screaming now, so close to his face that he could smell the liquor on his breath. "Get up." He came conscious face down, half on and half off the catwalk, running the edge of the chamber. He had been lucky. He was alive and coughing up water rather than floating face down in the center of the room, dead. He struggled and leaned back against the wall, gathering himself. Then he inched to the edge of the catwalk and jumped off and into the water. He couldn't find the plasma cutter. Maybe something had gone wrong. Maybe he had shaken loose when the doors were closing and had slid out into the water. Maybe it was gone. He resurfaced, holding onto the edge of the catwalk, then went down again, searching more carefully this time. He found it wedged behind the float, all but impossible to see until he was almost touching it. He worked it free and surfaced again, pulling himself out and onto the catwalk. Then he laid there on the grill a moment, breathing, trying to recover. When he got up, he was still shaky, his nerves jittery. He wiped the droplets off the wall comm unit with his palm and connected to the marker chamber. "Hello?" said Harmon, his voice a little panicked now. "Hello?" "It's me, Altman," he said. Harmon squinted at the screen. "Altman," he said. "I wondered if you were still alive. You still are, aren't you? This isn't a vision, is it? You look different." "I'm still alive," said Altman. "Just a little wet." "Where are you?" he asked. "Submarine Bay," said Altman. "Not far." Harmon nodded. He pulled a holofile up and spun it so that Altman could see. "Here you are," Harmon said, and a red blotch appeared on the map. "It's simple," he said. "Down this hallway, the one with the slight slope, then into a new hall, past these two labs, a final hall, and there you are." "What's between you and me?" asked Altman. "Close to the marker? Nothing," said Harmon. "They won't get close to the marker. If you can get into the final hallway, you should be all right. Before that, it might be a little trickier." He flashed Altman a view of the hallway just outside the submarine bay lock. The camera made a slow sweep, showing a pile of corpses, a ballad bat-like creature fluttering above them, and then dissolved into a wall of static. "This was just before the camera was destroyed," he said. "Who knows what's there now?" The view changed. 2 separate cameras, 2 labs. In one, a spider-like creature like the one he killed before, only this one had a 3rd head and a ridge of spines along its back. In the other, 2 of the creatures with the scythe-like blades. They lay on the ground motionless, perhaps dead. "These are current," Harmon said. "I'd suggest being quiet going past the labs. The hall itself and the hall after it seem to be empty." Altman took a deep breath. "All right," he said. "Here goes nothing." He stopped the airlock mechanism when it was only slightly open and looked through. The hall outside was dim, some of the emergency lights fluttering, others burnt out completely. But he could see from the dim shapes and tell from the sounds being made that they were there. And then an arm reached through the opening and grabbed him, wrapped itself around his own arm, and pulled hard, dragging him against the airlock. Or at least at first, he thought it was an arm. As he tried desperately to pry it off, he realized it wasn't an arm at all, but something more like a bundle of sinew, stretched long and hardened somehow. He tried to get the plasma cutter up, but his arm was flush against the hole, no space to cut. It tugged again and almost tore his arm off. He pulled back hard but couldn't get any purchase. Not knowing what else to do, he kicked the lever to continue opening the door. As soon as the opening was large enough, the sinew pulled him through. The hull had been remade, was covered in an organic layer, smeared with an approximation of flesh. It was like he was being tugged down in an intestine. He cut at the sinew with the plasma cutter, but the blade didn't go all the way through. The sinew jerked, just dragged him farther down the hall. He cried out in pain, cut again, and this time it cut through. There was a roaring sound. The rest of it slid rapidly down the hall and disappeared into an air duct. The piece that he had cut off was still digging tightly into his arm, cutting off the circulation. To get it off, he had to carefully section it. It was like walking through a nightmare. Blood and flesh everywhere, no idea where they were going to strike at you next. It was becoming jumpy, he knew. He needed to relax, needed to calm his nerves, or they'd get him. But how could you relax in a hell like this? Aching all over, he stumbled down the hall, wading through a kind of putrid slurry, trying not to touch the flesh-coated walls or ceilings. There was a corpse blocking the way. He tried to kick it out of the way, but as soon as he touched it, it hissed and lashed out at him. He stumbled back and slipped, and then it was on him, trying to slash his head off with its scythes that had been hidden beneath the water. He raised his knees and turned to see it up and over him, its drooling mouth just centimeters from his throat. He somehow got his hands between it and him, held it away. It hissed and shrieked in frustration, leaning hard on its scythes, trying to get closer. Its breath enough to make him want to retch. With a groan, he gave a mighty push and threw it to one side, then spun over and pulled the cutter from under him. It was already looming over him again, but he had the cutter now and lopped off one of its scythes. It kept coming at him with the other scythe and the stump. He brought the casing of the plasma cutter down hard, pulping its head. It kept coming. He scrambled back and away from it, stopped only to swipe at it. He took the rest of the stump off, then most of the other scythe. It thrashed for a while, half buried in the muck, and then stopped. It was only then, in the brief quiet, that he realized there was something coming up behind him. He leapt to his feet and turned, and the scythe cut through his forearm, making him drop the plasma cutter. He screamed and struck the thing open-palmed in the chest, hard, feeling the sickening smack of its dead flesh. It staggered back a little, and he managed to get the cutter up again, wincing with pain. It shrugged again, and he dropped to avoid its scythe, which whistled over his head, and kicked its leg out from under it. It fell on top of him, and for a moment, trapped in the muck and beneath its stinking, rotting flesh, he had the impression that he was already dead, that he was wandering the afterlife, living out a particular hell for all he had done wrong in this life. The cutter was trapped between his body and the creature above him. The creature was gnawing at his shoulder, working its way over to his neck, and was trying to prop itself on one bone scythe so as to swing the other through him. He pressed the trigger for the cutter, hoping it wasn't too low, and pointing down rather than up. The blade sprang between his knees, and he angled it up hard and through the creature's pelvis, forcing it up bit by bit, sawing it slowly in half. It fell to either side of him, but he still had to get up and stomp each of the halves before it stopped moving. He stumbled up. Blood was still spilling out of the cut in his arm. He tore off the bottom of his shirt and awkwardly bandaged himself. It wouldn't stop the bleeding, but it would slow it, and that would have to be enough for now. 2 more hallways, he thought. That's all. He went to the end of the hall. He had to cut away the growth around the door to find the controls, but once he'd done that and scanned his card, it opened fine. He looked in. Harmon was right. The hall looked fine. Nothing there. There to the side, there were 2 lab doors. He would just move forward as quietly as possible past them, and then he would be safe. He eased into the new hall, moving slowly, squishing sounds coming from his shoes, from the muck in the other room. He could hear movements behind the first door. He held his breath. And then he was past it, almost to the second door. He could hear a sound from behind that as well, a crackling sound, and then a low, long whine. He hurried his steps a little, but soon past that as well. He'd already reached the door at the end when one of the doors opened. He didn't look back to see which one it was, just pressed his card against the scanner and prayed the door would open soon enough. The low whine came again, louder this time, closer. The door began to slide open, and he rushed through it and into the final hall, casting a glance back to see the three-headed spider-like creature just standing there near the end of the hall, watching him. It was different from the other one. Its back, he saw, was covered with spikes, which, as he watched, began to stiffen and stand up. One spat off its back and shot toward him, embedding itself in the wall next to his face. All three of the creature's upside-down heads hissed in unison, but it didn't move forward, and the door between him and it slid shut. He reached the door at the end of the hall and engaged the comlink. "Who is it?" came Harmon's voice. "Who the hell do you think it is?" said Altman. "Altman?" he said. "How can I be sure it's you?" "Come on, Harmon, open up." "No," he said. "You have to tell me something that nobody but the real you, would know about me." What? Was he crazy? "I don't know you that well, Harmon. I don't have anything to tell." "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't open it," and cut the feed. Altman re-engaged the link. When Harmon picked it up, he said, "Don't disconnect. Turn on the vid feed and you'll see it's me." Harmon did. Altman saw his worried face squinting, peering at him. One hand was clutching something at the end of a necklace. "I don't know," he said slowly. "A vid can be faked. You're paranoid," said Altman, and then realized that yes, that was exactly what he was. The marker was making him that way. But, he remembered, Harmon was also a believer. "Look," Altman said quickly, "you're the one who told me that the creatures can't come close to the marker, right? If that's true, I must not be one of them. If I was one of them, I wouldn't be able to get this close. The marker will protect you if you believe in it. In the name of the marker, open the door." Harmon gave him a long, solemn look that Altman couldn't interpret. Then he reached out and pressed a button ending the vid transmission. A moment later, the door opened. Altman walked in slowly, his hands up. "Ah, it is you, Harmon said. "Marker be praised." Okay, hold on. My light is slowly dimming, so I need to quickly turn on a different light. "64. "I knew you were coming," said Harmon. "I just knew." He was, Altman noted, sweating profusely. His responses were disconnected, his voice zigzagging back and forth between being effectless and flat and a panic-stricken roar. He was clearly not in his right mind. "Actually, I called you and told you I was coming," said Altman. "No," Harmon said, his voice rising. "You didn't tell me. I knew." "Calm down," said Altman. "How do you know I'm the one?" "You're the only one who has come," said Harmon, speaking with a calm simplicity. "It has to be you, because you're the only one. Everyone else is dead." Altman slowly nodded. He might be able to play Harmon's belief in the marker to his advantage, he realized. He wanted Harmon to believe whatever he had to believe, to allow Altman to do what he needed to do. I came here, said Harmon. "This is the first place that I came, and then, when I saw that they couldn't come near me, I understood why. The marker wanted me here. I used to mistrust the marker, but I was wrong. The marker is protecting me. The marker loves me." "And me," said Altman. "And you," Harmon agreed. He reached out and took Altman's arm. His hands was feverish, burning hot. "Do you believe?" he asked. Altman shrugged. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" "And have you understood my message?" he asked. He looked at Altman expectantly, clearly waiting. "Message received," Altman finally said. Harmon smiled. "I asked you to gather some information," said Altman. "Do you have it?" Harmon gestured to the holoscreen. There was a series of holofiles, some of which Altman had seen and some that he had not. There were vid images of the interior of the first battlescav taken after the battlescav had been brought up. He had seen bits of it before, first in the intercepted vid from Hennessy, and then later from the outside through the window. As the camera taking the images scanned slowly, he recognized the scrawlings in blood as symbols from the marker. But, he also realized, they were not in the same order or sequence as they appeared on the marker. What he'd seen before was a symptom of madness now actually struck him as a rudimentary calculations and seemed to contain a glimmer of sense. In addition, there were analysis of the marker's structure and density, hundreds of dissections of its transmissions, speculations, unproven theories. There was information about the different genetic codes that Showalter and Guth had read into the signal in the marker. There were, in the end, more files than he could read, even more files than he could skim. Thousands and thousands of pages and images and hours of vids. What was important and what wasn't? What was he going to do? How was he to start? Harmon was crouched on the deck beside his chair, staring at the marker. Have you ever seen anything like it?" asked Harmon. "No," said Altman. "It's good," said Harmon. "It loves us, I can tell. I touched it, and when I touched it, I felt its love." "You felt something?" said Altman. "I felt its love," insisted Harmon, shouting now. Apoplectic. "It loves us. Touch it and you'll see." Altman shook his head. Touch it! Touch it! Harmon was still screaming. And so Altman, not knowing how else to calm him, stood up, walked across the chamber, and did. It was not love he felt, but something different. Something that was not a feeling at all. At first, it was as if he was experiencing all the hallucinations he had had at once, as if he was experiencing all the experiences of any the others had had, all laid over one another. Most of it interfered with itself, created a kind of blinding static that blotted itself out. But beyond that, and in spite of it, he could see something he hadn't seen before. He could see that the hallucinations were not a function of the marker, but of something else that stood in opposition to it, of something that was ingrained in his own brain. The hallucinations had been trying to protect them, but they had failed. The process had begun. Now all he could do was try to satisfy the marker enough that the process would stop, but not do enough to lead to a full-fledged convergence. And then suddenly something cleared, and he could see past the hallucinations to glimpse the marker itself. It was as if it were changing the structure of his brain, reworking connections, rewiring circuits to make him understand. Suddenly he felt he could see the structure of the marker from the inside, and in a way that gave him a complex appreciation of it. It filled his head and set it aflame, and then poured it out through the cracks in his skull and took him with it. When he came conscious, Harmon was over him, stroking his head, a beatific smile on his face. "You see?" he said when he noticed that Altman's eyes were open. "You see?" Altman pushed him away and stood, stalking quickly over to the monitor. He began to type frantically, sketching a structure out as well. His hands were moving faster than his brain, working on different bits and pieces of it all at once, flipping from holofile to holofile and back again. he realized with a shock, recording the basic rudiments for a blueprint of a new marker. It was sloppy and skew. There were a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of mysteries to be sorted out, but that was definitely what he was doing. What is it? Harmon was asking from behind him. What's going on? I figured it out, Altman answered. I thought I figured it out before, but I was still struggling to understand what it meant. Now I know. He worked a while longer, how long he couldn't say. His head was spinning, his fingers aching. When he had finished, he turned to Harmon. I need your help, he said. What is it? I need you to help me translate what I have here, best as you can, and feed the signal back to the marker. At first, Harmon just stared, and then he slowly sat down, took a closer look. He went through it slowly. Suddenly, he glanced up at Altman, the first coherent look he'd given since Altman had entered. This is the marker, he said, awe in his voice. You understood it, just as she asked you to do. Altman nodded. You want me to transmit to the marker the image of itself? He asked. Yes, said Altman. Marker be praised, said Harmon. And then he added, Altman be praised. It made his skin crawl to hear Harmon say his name like that, but he bit his tongue and said nothing. What he had done was far from complete, would require years and years more work, but hopefully it would be enough right now to stop the process of convergence. It took a few more hours and a few attempts to transmit in different ways before something connected. The marker sent out a short, intense burst of energy, and then, as suddenly as it had begun broadcasting, it fell silent. What's wrong with it? Asked Harmon. It's resting, said Altman. We've done what it wanted us to do. We've saved the world. "65. After it was over, he sat there for a long time, thinking. Why did the marker want to be reproduced? What effect would it have? What did it mean? And if the hallucinations, the visions, weren't from the marker but were opposed to it, where were they from? Which of the two was on their side? He still didn't trust it. No, what he had felt when he touched the marker was not love, but nothing. Total, absolute indifference to the human race. They were a means to an end. What that end was, he wasn't certain, but felt, more than ever, that for the marker they were expendable, a necessary step on the way to something else. When the new marker was constructed, and he had no doubt that that was what the marker intended, what would happen then? He had stopped the convergence, but perhaps by doing so he had jump-started a discovery that would lead humanity to an even worse fate. Then again, another part of him responded, what if you're wrong? What if you're being paranoid? Or what if the love Harmon had felt was his own feelings, his own emotions mirrored back to him, his own religious love for the marker being reflected as the marker's love for him? What if the indifference Altman sensed was not something inherent to the marker, but something integral to himself, reflected back? He sat there, thinking, but getting nowhere. What was he going to do now? Now that he'd given the marker what it wanted, had he inadvertently made things worse for humanity? We'll have to go, he said to Harmon. The marker wants us to leave. How do you know? It told me, said Altman. Harmon nodded. He went to the marker and touched his lips to it. Sorry. Okay, dude. He went to the marker and touched his lips to it. He was no longer paranoid, no longer jumpy, no doubt because the marker had stopped broadcasting, but he was still a believer. Where are we going? Harmon asked. To the control room, said Altman. I have something to take care of, and then we can leave. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe that when the marker stopped broadcasting, the creatures would lose power, would collapse, even fall apart. But it wasn't like that. When they left the marker chamber and went down the hall and opened the door at the far end, it was to find the strange spider-like creature still there, still waiting for him. It was a little slower, maybe, a little more listless, but it was still there, still eager to kill them both. Seeing that only strengthened his commitment to do what he planned. They opened the door and saw it. The creature's back began to bristle. Altman grabbed Harmon, pulled them both behind the door frame. The strange conical projections it cast from its back whipped down the hall and past them, wonking into the walls. He stuck his head back out and waited for what it would do next. All three heads, he saw, were loose now, scurrying toward them. He thumbed on the plasma cutter. "You might want to stay back," he said to Harmon, and then stepped into the doorway. He caught the first with the blade as it leapt at him, separating the head from its tendrils. The head, still grimacing, bounced and ricocheted off the wall, and he crushed it with his foot. The second he caught with an upward thrust as it scurried along the ceiling just above the door frame. Then he had to step back and press against the wall again as the creature slung more barbs at him. The last, he had to pry off Harmon's neck. It had gone past him somehow. He didn't know how. He didn't even know it had attached itself to Harmon. It wouldn't have known if Harmon hadn't grabbed him from behind and shook him. He turned, saw Harmon going purple, thought, "Not this again," and sliced the thing in half, somehow managing not to take Harmon's face off along with it. Harmon coughed, rubbed his throat. "Altman be praised," he suggested in a hoarse whisper. "Stop saying that," said Altman. "Altman doesn't want to be praised." He glanced again around the doorframe. The creature was moving forward now, its spear-like legs rattling down the hall and coming toward them. He put his fingers to his lips, warning Harmon to be quiet, then flattened himself against the wall. He heard it coming, the tapping of each leg, a kind of complex, echoing rhythm that suddenly made itself difficult for him to tell exactly how close it really was. He heard it pause at the doorframe. He kept expecting it to sidle through, but for some reason it didn't. Instead, it turned around and started back the other way. "Shit," thought Altman. "So much for ambushes," and he rushed out round the doorframe and after it. It spun around, surprisingly quick despite its many legs. He sheared off the one nearest to him, then threw himself to the floor as its back bristled and it spat its barbs. He sliced off another leg on the same side, almost lost his footing as it stabbed one of its remaining legs down. Another swipe and it crashed to one side, disabled. He dismembered it, careful this time not to cut into the yellow and black tumor. He went back for Harmon, and they continued down the hall. They passed the laboratory doors and saw that they were open. Inside the second one, two of the creatures with scythes turned about in circles, performing a strange dance, as if the marker, before falling silent, had sent them a message that they could not interpret, and now they were caught in some kind of glitch, forced to perform the same motion again and again. Not knowing what else to do, Altman moved quietly past. If they noticed him, they didn't show it. Instead of going through the next hall and into the submarine bay, they took the side passage and cut up and back toward the command center. There were two more of the scythers, these directly in the hall. Same lost movements, blocking the way. But as soon as he touched one with a plasma cutter, both of them attacked. Harmon turned and, wailing, fled back down the hall. Altman cut the leg out from under one, but he couldn't get the weapon around before the other was on him, its scythe wrapped around him and drawing him in, its mouth pressed to his neck and tearing at it, making a moaning sound, the neck burning as well from whatever fluid the dead mouth was secreting. He cut into its chest and through its torso, and its leg fell off, but the top half of it continued to cling. The other one, legless and all, had dragged itself forward by its scythes and was trying to climb up his leg. He tried to pull the head of the first one away. Tried to drag it off his neck, but couldn't. The cutter was still trapped. He held down the button and brought it up, carving slowly through the creature's torso, then over to the side to cut off one of its scythes. From here, he could shake it off, then stomp both it and its companion out of existence. He stumbled back down the hall until he found Harmon. "Come on," he said tiredly. "Let's go." He didn't have authorization to open the command center, but Harmon did. The command center was clear, empty inside, perhaps because the marker was there just above it. He went over to the console, found what he was looking for. He entered the sequence in, found himself locked out. He entered it in again. "Override? Yes or no?" the holoscreen asked him. "Yes." "Enter authorization code." "Harmon," he asked, "do you have an authorization code?" "Why?" said Harmon. "What do you want it for?" "I don't want it," said Altman. "The marker does." After a brief pause, Harmon gave the code to him. He entered it. Immediately, an alarm started to sound. "Flooding sequence will begin in 10 minutes. Cancel sequence, yes or no?" "What did you do?" shouted Harmon. "No." The countdown began. Sequence can be cancelled at any time by pressing N. Harmon was screaming behind him. "What are you doing?" he was shouting over and over again. Ullman grabbed him and shook him. "I'm sinking it," he said. Harmon had a hurt look on his face, seemed ready to melt into tears. "Why?" he asked. "To protect the marker," lied Altman. "It was down there for a reason, to keep it safe, and to kill these creatures. I promise you, Harmon, this is what needs to happen." "You have to stop the countdown," said Harmon. "No," said Altman. "Then I'll stop it," said Harmon. "No," said Altman, holding the plasma cutter up near his face. "You're coming with me, either that or I'll kill you." The pressure inside the station had already started to shift. There was a trickle of water in the corridor as he entered, the process starting slowly, nothing that couldn't be reversed. The system, he knew, would not commit fully until the full 10 minutes had passed. At first, Harmon was in a rage, and then overcome with tears, which slowly reduced to sniffles and petered out entirely. Omen thought for a moment he'd have to kill him, but finally he allowed himself to be coaxed, prodded along. Alman looked at his chronometer. "We don't have much time," he said. "I don't know what creatures are still alive on the decks above or how long it'd take me to kill them. We have to go out the submarine bay." "I didn't know there was still a submarine there," said Harmon. "There isn't," said Altman. "Then how?" "We're going to swim," said Altman. "I'll flood the bay and open the doors. As soon as they open, swim out as quickly as you can and make for the surface. There's a rope. If you see it, follow it up. It'll lead you to the boat platform. I've left the boat moored there. It'll be right behind you. I'll be right behind you." Eyes wide, Harmon nodded. They moved out. Altman took the lead, stayed on watch. Nothing. There must be more of the creatures in the facility, but he wasn't seeing them. He kept expecting them to crash their way out through a vent, or to hear a door slide open behind him and find one suddenly looming over him. But no, nothing. That was almost worse than if there was something. He kept intense, expectant, a coiled spring of energy that never could release itself. By the time they reached the door of the submarine bay, there were 2 minutes left. The water was up to their knees in the corridor, and when he tried to open the bay doors, they wouldn't respond. He threw the override and forced the doors open enough that they could slip through. The water from the hull pouring in along with them. He tried to shut the door, but couldn't get it shut. As long as it wasn't shut, he wouldn't be able to flood the chamber. He called for Harmon to help him, but the man just stood there motionless, staring down over the edge of the catwalk. Altman finally had to yell at him, threaten him. Together, with Altman working the manual controls and Harmon pushing the door along, they forced it shut. "Swim higher in the chambers as the water rises," Altman said. "Keep your head above it until you get to the ceiling. Then once it starts to cover you, dive down and swim out the bottom. Got it?" Harmon didn't respond. Altman slapped him. "Got it?" he yelled. Harmon nodded. They began to flood the chamber. At first, Harmon just stood there, watching the cold water rise, swirling up his legs, and for a moment, Altman just expected him to stand there, watching, not moving, and drown. But when the water reached his chest, he suddenly took a deep, gasping breath and began to paddle. "Remember," called Altman, floating now himself, "up to the ceiling and then down and out the bottom and then all the way up to the surface, but not too fast." He tried to keep his breathing slow, measured. The water all around him was swirling and foamy, and it was some effort to keep above it. He watched Harmon, but he seemed to be doing all right now. Twice he disappeared beneath the surface, but he reappeared again almost immediately. And then Altman's head grazed the ceiling. He looked up at it and grabbed onto the grating there, holding still, breathing slowly in and out until the water covered his face. He dived, stroking back to the controls and opened the bay floor. Harmon was already down there, he saw, knocking against the metal of the floor, trying to get out. As soon as the floor split, he was through it and gone. Altman quickly followed. The water was much darker than it had been earlier. He struck through it blindly, trying to go straight out, and then turned and started to rise too soon, striking the underside of the bay. He swam out farther and then made for the surface. It wasn't as hard as going down, but it was difficult. The temptation was to go too quickly, which would have left him cramped and shivering and probably killed him. So he went up slowly, all the while aware of the way his air was running out, his heart beating slower and slower. By the time he finally broke the surface, his lungs felt like they were on fire. There was a sliver of moon, just enough to see by. He looked around, saw the ghost of the boat platform, but no sign of Harmon. He spun his head around but didn't see him. "Harmon," he called out as loud as he could. He kicked up, trying to pull himself as far out of the water as he could. Even then, he wouldn't have seen it if it hadn't been for the way a dip caught the platform and showed him the head floating on the other side. He swam to the platform, climbed the ladder up onto it, and stumbled along the swing platform to its farther side. The facility now had started to settle strangely, listing in the water. There was the roar of water rushing into it, or maybe the roar was from something else. The whole structure creaking, too, as the change in buoyancy shifted its weight, putting pressure on girders and links. "Harmon," he called again. But the man didn't hear him. Perhaps he couldn't hear him over the noise. Altman dived in, swam to him, touched him. "Harmon," he said, "come on." He was confused and seemed dizzy, in a state of shock. Altman slapped him, pulled him toward the platform. He got him swimming again, though somewhat lethargically, and had to practically drag him up onto the platform once they arrived. The platform was already listing, half submerged in water, being dragged down by the sinking dome. He pulled Harmon over to the boat and dumped him in and fell in himself. Then the dome behind them creaked noticeably lower, and the platform was underwater. The mooring rope between it and the boat stretched taut, the boat listing hard to one side, threatening to turn over. His fingers shaking, he picked at the knot, but the pressure had tightened it too much for him to loosen it. His eyes cast desperately around for a knife, but he didn't see one. There was an anchor, though, and he grabbed it up and began striking the mooring with it as hard as he could, trying to break it free. The boat tipped farther, very close to taking on water. "Get to the far side of the boat," he cried at Harmon, but couldn't look around to see if he did. He kept hitting the mooring with hard, smashing blows. Suddenly the boat bobbed back and threw him to the boards. It was only after scrambling up again with the anchor that he realized the mooring and the rope were gone, that he had succeeded. The boat began to swirl. There was a sucking sound as the facility began to go down in earnest. He leapt into the driver's seat and started the craft, throwing the throttle down hard. The boat leapt forward, but it was heading wrong, directly towards the dome. He corrected it, but there was still something wrong. They were caught in a vortex, some sort of whirlpool that the facility was creating as it went down. Instead of forcing the rudder against it, he turned and followed it, trying to edge carefully free. The last dome slipped all the way under and was gone. He felt the drag on the rudder, but kept it steady, trying not to look to the side, trying not to panic. For an instant, he felt the boat resisting him, threatening either to turn and plunge downward or to flip over. But then suddenly they were free. He sped away, looking back over his shoulder. The inside of the compound, the little he could see of it through the waves, was flashing and sparking. The electrical systems and generators still in the process of shorting out. He had just a glimpse of it, and then it was gone. He took the boat in a long curve, then headed back towards Chicxulub. He was just thinking he should check on Harmon when he realized that he was standing there behind him. He turned and was struck in the side of the head by the anchor, knocked out of his seat. "You were lying, Altman," Harmon said. "The marker didn't want to be sunk. You don't love the marker. You hate it." "No," he tried to say. "No," but nothing came out. He saw Harmon bend over him. He roughly took hold of Altman's hands, put them together, began to tie them. "I thought you were my friend," said Harmon. "I thought you were a believer, but if you were really a believer, why don't you have one of these?" He touched the marker pendant hanging from his neck. "I shouldn't have trusted you." "I saved you," Altman tried to say. "I could have left you to die, but I saved your life." "Now I'm going to get some real help," said Harmon, and he stood and took the controls. Altman lay there, eyes glazed. A warm fluid was puddling up against his cheek and his mouth. It was only when he tried to swallow that he realized it was blood. It took him another minute to realize it was his own. "Okay," he thought. "I've been in worse situations." He tried to move his hand but couldn't feel them. It was as if his body had become disconnected from his head. "I'll just rest a moment," he told himself. "I'll just lie here and then, in a moment, I'll wriggle free of these ropes." His vision started to go dim, and then slowly faded away. He listened to the sound of the engine. Then that slowly left him too. He lay there, feeling the movement of the boat through the waves. After a while, it seemed to only come from a distance. A while longer, and even that was lost. He lay in the boat, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, feeling nothing. The whole world had dissolved around him. He tried as long as he could to focus on the taste of blood in his mouth, but soon he couldn't hold on to even that. Epilogue. And then it began again. It started first with a pinprick of light in the darkness at a great distance. He watched it, trying to determine if it was getting closer or farther away, but was unable to say. He watched it a long time, or what felt like a long time, until it disappeared again. Darkness, plain and simple, but a sense, too, of a body, of his body, the limits of it. "I'm dead," he thought. "This is hell." There was a long moment in which nothing happened. The pinprick of light came back again. He did not notice it reappear exactly, just knew that it was there, and knew it had been there for a while. He watched it. This time it grew slowly larger. It was moving slowly toward him. Suddenly, it became excruciatingly bright. Things began to take shape around it. A thin, silvery casing from which the light itself came. Something pinkish nestled around it, which he began slowly to realize was a human hand. "A low response," said the voice, flat, uninflected. "Up the dosage." He felt something, a stinging somewhere on his body. Suddenly he could move the muscles on his face. "Where am I?" he tried to ask, but what came out was a dim, inarticulate sound. "There we are," said another voice. The light pulled back and he saw a face, half hidden behind a surgical mask. Behind it were other faces, maybe a half dozen in all. "Where am I?" he asked, and this time the words came out. "You're alive," said the muffled voice through the surgeon's mask. "That's all you need to know." He tried to move his arm, found it strapped down. The other arm was strapped too, his legs as well. He struggled against them, arched his back. There, said the voice. "You won't be able to break them. Just relax." The surgeon's mask turned to address someone behind him. Go get Markov, it said. Tell him that Altman is awake. He must have drifted off again. When he opened his eyes, there were 3 people over the bed, looking down at him. Krax, Markov, and Stevens. Congratulations, Altman, said Krax. You still seem to be alive. When he opened his mouth and spoke, his voice was hoarse, his throat sore. You killed Ada, he said. No, said Krax. Ada killed herself. She started hallucinating and then cut her own throat. She wasn't strong enough. She wasn't worthy. Worthy? Altman asked. We need to have a little talk, said Markov. Altman narrowed his eyes. He watched him warily. We talked with your friend Harmon, said Krax. He told us everything that happened. You sank the marker, said Stevens. Why would you do that? It was dangerous, said Altman, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not dangerous, claimed Krax. It's divine. You're crazy, said Altman. No, he's right, said Stevens. I'm afraid that's the conclusion that all 3 of us have reached. Altman turned his head slightly in Markov's direction. It hurt to move. You don't believe this, do you? How can you believe it's divine now that you've seen what it's capable of? Markov offered him a hard, glittering smile. It created life, he said. I saw that for myself. Saw it take dead flesh and bring it back to life. Maybe he doesn't actually believe, thought Altman. Or maybe he's pretending as a way of bending the others to his will, just as I did with Harmon. But what kind of life? Asked Altman. It was monstrous. There must have been a glitch, said Stevens. The marker must have gotten damaged somehow. But as a principle, it's sound. All we have to do is fix it. Or if not fix it, make a new one, said Markov. After all, said Stevens, every indication is that when it was originally working millennia ago, it established life on Earth. Once we have one that's working properly, it will allow us to evolve beyond our mortal form. It will lead us into eternal life. No, it's not that. It's not that at all. You're wrong, whispered Altman. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't doing what it was. It was doing what it was meant to do. It meant to destroy us. Then why did you stop it? Stevens asked. And why did it stop when you began to broadcast its own code back to it, showing that you figured out how to replicate it? How do you know about that? You don't think we left the facility without making sure that we could record everything that went on in it, do you? Said Krax. We watched the whole thing. We have footage of everything. But Ullman shook his head. You're wrong, he said. It'll destroy us. The marker wants to help us, Stevens claimed. Harmon has told us what you figured out. The marker wants to be replicated. It was broken and must have known it was broken. It wants us to make it again so that it can help us. But we'll improve the technology, Altman. We'll make one that works and then make it even better. He leaned in closer. Altman could feel the man's breath on his face, could see the man's eyes trace of fanaticism that belied his calm exterior. There are sure to be other markers somewhere on other worlds, said Stevens. They will lead us forward. In the meantime, we'll do our best to try to understand this one and duplicate it. You've done a lot to help with that, Markov said. But this one is sunk, said Altman desperately. It was sunk before, said Markov. And we got it up. You know that as well as anyone. All you did was slow the inevitable down slightly. By a few weeks, a few months. You don't have the research, said Altman. Everything must have been destroyed by the water and the pressure. You have to start over. Krax shook his head. Altman, he said, you're so naive. Remember Harmon? Said Markov. What do you think Harmon was doing while he was in the marker chamber? He was recording everything, making sure that none of the data would be lost, and then he carried it all the way in his pocket. If you thought to check his pockets or simply left him to die, you might have set us back, but you didn't. You're far too trusting, Altman. We have everything. We also have all of Guth's research, said Stevens. We can learn from it what went wrong with the marker and learn how to repair it. We ran our first experiments, synthesizing, reproducing the creature's DNA while you were still unconscious. Hermetically sealed labs, a variety of fail-safes. We're being a great deal more careful about it than Guth was, though most likely hallucinations were to blame for his rashness. And to be frank, said Krax, watching you struggle past them taught us a great deal about how to control them. We wouldn't be nearly as far along without you. You're making a terrible mistake, whispered Altman. He was very tired. He was helpless, couldn't do anything. But maybe soon, all he had to do was regain his strength. Once he regained his strength, he'd do everything he could to stop them. If you go ahead with this, it'll mean the end of humanity. Maybe not right away, but soon. That's what we're hoping for, said Stevens. If we go ahead with this, we'll reach the next evolutionary stage. We won't be human, we'll be better than human. Goodbye, Altman, said Markov. You've been a worthy adversary, but this time you've lost. Once the three of them had left, a doctor who had accompanied them to the door returned and whispered in the surgeon's ear. The surgeon nodded his head and then filled up and primed a hypodermic. He pushed it into Altman's arm. The world grew gray, slowly faded away. The world grew gray, slowly faded away. 2. When he woke up, he was still strapped down to a bed. He was alone in a small room, something very like a cell. He struggled against the straps, but they were firm. He slept, he woke, he slept again. Occasionally, a nurse would come in and change the bag of fluids hanging beside him. His head throbbed. Once, when the nurse came, she took out a small pocket mirror and held it so he could see himself. His head was wrapped in bandages. He hardly recognized his own face. There, see? Said the nurse, and gestured to the top of his head. That's where you had your accident. Accident? He said. Yes, she said. Where you slipped and fell. It wasn't an accident, he said. She smiled. After head trauma, sometimes things can get confused, she said. No, he said. I know exactly what happened. Her smile looked painted on, fake. I'm not supposed to talk to you, she said. Those are the rules. She backed slowly out the door. A few minutes later, the door opened and the man with a hypodermic entered. When he woke up again, he was in a different place. A place that didn't just look like a cell, but was one. The bandages were no longer on his head, though a lump and a healing wound were still there. They had unstrapped him and had left him lying on the floor. He got unsteadily to his feet, his muscles weak from disuse. The room was white, without mark or other design. There was one door, small, in the middle of one wall. High above him and out of reach was a vid recorder, a small toilet in the corner, a food dispenser just beside it. He went to the door and pounded on it. Hello? He called. Hello? Then he pressed his ear to the door. He heard nothing. He waited, tried again. Nothing happened. And then again. Still nothing. Hours went by, then days. The only noise that did not come from himself was the clunk when food came down the slot. There was no way for him to control when it came, no button to push. Suddenly there was a clunk, and then the food was there. He saved the containers, and they slowly filled one side of the room. He felt like he was the last man on Earth. He felt like he was going mad. He withdrew deeper and deeper into himself, paid less and less attention to the outside world. Then the dead started to return, one by one, to keep him company. All the people whose deaths he felt responsible for, sitting around him, judging him. There was Ada and Field, Hendricks and Hammond, and others he couldn't recognize. It was just him and his guilt and the dead. And then he awoke to find that he was no longer in that room, that instead he was sitting in a chair at a large table. His hands were cuffed to the arms of the chair. Across from him, on the other side of the table, were Markov and Stevens. Hello, Altman, said Markov. He didn't answer at first. It was strange to be in a room with living people, almost unbearable. He couldn't believe it was really happening again. He couldn't believe it was really happening. Altman, said Stevens. He snapped his fingers. Here, Altman, focus. You're not here, said Altman. I'm hallucinating you. No, said Stevens. We're here. Even if we're not, what will hurt you? What will it hurt you to talk to us? He's right, said Altman. What will it hurt? And then he remembered Hennessy, dead from listening to a hallucination. Hendricks, dead from listening to a hallucination. Ada, dead from listening to a hallucination. On and on and on, his eyes filled with tears. What's wrong with him? Markov asked. We broke him, said Stevens. I told you it was too long. We're real, Altman. What do we have to do to prove that we're real? You can't prove it, said Altman. Do something, Stevens, said Markov. He's not any fun like this. Stevens darted forward, slapped him hard, then again. Altman reached up and touched his cheek. Did you feel that? Asked Stevens, his voice gently mocking. Had he felt it, or had he only imagined feeling it? He didn't know, but he had to make a choice, either speak to them or ignore them. He hesitated for so long that Stevens, or the Stevens hallucination, slapped him again. Well, he said. Yes, said Altman. Maybe you're real? And as he said it, it was almost as if they became more real. But if he had insisted they were hallucinations, would the reverse have happened? Would they have merely faded away? That's better, said Markov. His eyes started to gleam. Where's Cracks? He asked. Markov waved the question away. Cracks made the mistake of becoming expendable. What we're here to talk about, Altman, is you. What about me? We had to figure out what to do with you, said Stevens. You've caused a lot of trouble. That stunt you pulled in Washington, said Markov, that was in very bad taste. I wanted to kill you for that. Why didn't you? Markov glanced briefly at Stevens. Cooler heads prevailed, he said. As it turned out, they were wrong. I'm the first to admit it, said Stevens. You were no better once you came back, said Markov. You meddled with experiments, caused a tremendous amount of property damage, did everything you could to get in the way. Once the setback occurred on the floating compound, I thought, well, they'll tear him apart and transform him into one of them, and I'll be at home with my popcorn and candy, watching it on the screen. But that didn't work either. Instead, you sank $1 billion research facility. We almost had you killed when we picked you and Harmon up from the boat, but Markov wanted your death to be the perfect thing, said Stevens. Yes, said Markov, the perfect thing. You're both crazy, said Altman. You've used that one before, said Markov. You need to come up with a better insult. Would you like to hear our plans? No, said Altman. Send me back to my cell. Stevens ignored him. Once we have the secret of the marker worked out, once we have the new marker replicated, we'll share it with the public. Until then, we'll give them little tastes, something to prepare them for what's coming. That's where you come in, said Markov. Stevens nodded. Seen in that light, you have played right into our hands. It's not enough for just us to believe. Since it's a matter of the salvation of the human species, we need to spread the belief. What better way to do that than to start a formal religion? That way, when the right time comes, they'll be ready. Not everybody has to know the full extent of what's really going on, said Markov. Indeed, it's better if only a few of us really know the details. Only a select inner circle. It's always better to maintain a little mystery, initiate people slowly, gradually. Keep the power in the right hands. Altman found his hands were shaking. But I got the word out, he said. I went public. People will know. Yes, you did, said Stevens. Thank you for doing that. The word you got out was was that the government is hiding something that the people should know about. Think about it. We looked back over all the footage, all the interviews you did. You were conflicted enough about whether the marker was something to be feared or something to be studied, and so you remained vague. We can spin your comments in any way we want. By the time we're through with you, not only will your little stunt not hurt us, you'll be considered a saint. You got the word out first, Altman. You're the one who started it all. Everyone will believe that you were the one who founded the religion. I'll never go along with it, said Altman, dread rising in him. Markov laughed. We never said we needed you to go along with it, he said. Like any prophet, you're more useful to us dead than alive, said Stevens. Once you're dead, we can let the truth, our truth, build up around you, and you can't do anything about it. You'll be larger than life. We'll write histories of you, holy books. We'll erase what we don't like about you and make you fit what we want. Your name will be forever associated with the Church of Unitology. You'll come to be known as our founder, which will allow the rest of us to stay in the background and get things done, said Markov. I must admit, I find it very satisfying to think of your name leading the movement that you tried so hard to destroy. It must make all the trouble you caused feel worthwhile. You'll never get away with this, said Altman. Markov smiled, showing the tips of his teeth. You can't honestly believe that, Stevens said. Of course we'll get away with it. You have officially become expendable, said Markov. We've decided to donate your body to science. We have a particularly vicious death planned for you. You'll find this interesting, said Stevens. Using a variant of the genetic material that Guth produced, we developed a specimen that we'd be interested in having you meet. It was made by combining the tissue of 3 human corpses with the DNA. We've named it after one of the corpses. We're calling it the Cracks. The results, as I'm sure you'll be likely to agree, are rather surprising. Altman tried to lunge across the desk, but succeeded. Altman tried to lunge across the I'm like malfunctioning right now. Altman tried to lunge across the desk, but succeeded in only turning over his chair. He lay there with his face pressed against the floor. After a moment, Markov and Steven got up from their chairs and heaved him back upright. Cracks, by the way, was lying to you when he said he didn't kill your girlfriend, said Markov. What was her name again? Doesn't matter, I suppose. He did kill her. A generally inconsistent character, which is why he became expendable. Altman didn't answer. So there's your motivation, said Stevens. Revenge. Kill the Cracks and Ada's death will be avenged. Should make for a good show, he smiled. It seems fitting, doesn't it? An appropriate way for you to meet your end. Who could ask for anything more? You may think we're going to throw you in there defenseless. If you think that, you're wrong. We have a weapon for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a spoon, forced it into Altman's closed fist. Here you go, he said. Good luck. And then, without another word, the pair stood and left the room. 3. The chamber they dumped him into was circular, about 6 meters in diameter. They pushed him through a pressure door and had left him there, gripping his absurd weapon for too long. He had tried to make it a little less absurd, scraping against the walls and sharpening its edges, giving it a point, making it a makeshift knife. The observation chamber was directly overhead, the same size and shape as the chamber below. The glass ceiling of the lower chamber served as the glass floor of the upper one. He could see Stevens and Markov above, looming over him. They were drinking glasses of champagne, smiling. It's one thing to be killed, thought Altman, but dying knowing what infamy will be done in your name after your death is another thing entirely. Better to be like the old drunk in the town and have no name. The second door of the chamber slid open to reveal a dark corridor. He stayed where he was, near the door he had been pushed through, waiting for something to come through. Nothing did. The world is hell, thought Altman. You can do everything right and cheat death, and then be ruined by one false step. Those apparently were the conditions of life, of his life, at least. The smell suddenly reached him. It was rank, rotting odor, putrid to an extreme. He gagged, and then he heard a heavy scraping sound, and the creature pulled itself in through the door. It scraped against the sides of the passage as it came. He could see, here and there, reminders that it had once been human. A foot that had been stretched and split and now projected from the joint of the creature's chitinous gigantic arm. Finger-like tendrils throbbed over its face, and there, in the middle of its pulsating abdomen, was a large callus that looked like Krax's screaming face. It pushed the rest of the way into the room and howled. Oh God, he thought. Let this be a hallucination. Let this be a dream. Let me wake up. He closed his eyes and then he opened them again. The creature was still there. It roared, and then it charged. Like, you know he dies. From the game, you know he dies, but like, oof. Because what was the lore in the game? That the government had him run over by a car. At least that's what I remember. This is so much worse. This is so much worse. But I mean, because this is a prologue, you already know that this was not going to be a happy. This was not going to be a happy ending. Okay, yeah. So that finally, I finished Dead Space Martyr. If I do want, I don't know, I do want to continue this code reading thing. There is Dead Space. There's actually 2 more books in the Dead Space novel series. One of them I'm not interested in reading, mainly because it's just a prologue for the 3rd game, which one I haven't played yet. But there is Dead Space Catalyst, which someone had I was supposed to say requested. I'm not sure requested is the right word, but they recommended or they commented about it in one of the community post comments. It's either that, Dead Space Catalyst next, or I kind of want to read the light novel for solo leveling. That said, I don't know if I can find official translations, or at least there are official translations, but it's like one of those websites where you have to, each chapter you have to pay a certain amount of money. I don't know. It's like a lot of like web comics, especially in foreign ones, seem to have that money making model, and I don't care for it. I'd rather just buy a book to save it. And in my head, I think it's usually cheaper that way. Either way, this was Dead Space Martyr. We finally finished the book. Sorry, Michael Altman. Sorry. Until next time, guys, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya.